The clock tower's secret. The village of Black Hollow had always been a place of quiet routine, where life moved with the steady rhythm of the great clock tower that loomed over its narrow streets. Its chimes, deep and sonorous, marked the passing of each hour with unwavering precision. Generations had lived and died beneath its watchful gaze, yet none knew the secrets it held within its ancient stone walls. It was to this tower that Elias Whitmore, a humble clockmaker, had devoted his life. He was a man of precision and discipline, whose hands, though aged and calloused, worked with the delicacy of an artist. He had inherited his trade from his father, who had, in turn, inherited it from his own before him. The keeping of the clock was a sacred duty, one passed through the Whitmore line for centuries. Yet Elias knew that the tower was not merely a machine of cogs and pendulums. It held something more, something that whispered to him in the stillness of the night, in the soft click of unseen gears turning, when no hands moved them. It was on a moonless evening, when the winds howled through the village streets, that he discovered the truth. Elias had ascended the spiraling stone staircase, a lantern flickering in his grasp, to inspect the mechanism as he had done countless times before. The chamber at the tower's summit was filled with the scent of oil and aged wood, the rhythmic ticking of the gears echoing in the confined space. Yet that night, something was different. As he passed his hand over the great brass casing that housed the pendulum, his fingers caught upon an imperfection, a seam where no seam should be. His breath quickened. With trembling hands, he retrieved his tools and pried at the hidden compartment. The metal groaned in protest before giving way, revealing a hollow chamber within. Inside, wrapped in a cloth of blackened silk, lay an object unlike any he had ever seen. It was a device of polished silver, its surface engraved with markings that bore no resemblance to any script he had encountered. Gears lay within, yet they moved without touch, shifting as though alive. At its center, a small dial glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. Elias lifted it with careful hands, and as he did, the clock above him shuddered. The chimes rang out, though the hour was long past. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling a gust of cold air that set his skin ablaze with unease. A voice, soft, yet insistent, whispered in his ear, "Turn the dial." It was foolishness, he knew. Yet his fingers moved of their own accord, setting the dial back by mere minutes. The world around him blurred. The air thickened, distorting like ripples upon a pond. When the stillness returned, Elias found himself standing in the same chamber, but the flame of his lantern flickered in reverse, the melted wax climbing back into its candle. The chimes that had rung out moments before now remained silent. The clock had been rewound. A terrible thrill coursed through his veins. The device had power, true power. If mere minutes could be undone, what of hours? What of days? That night, he returned to his home in a state of feverish excitement, the device hidden beneath his coat. His mind swirled with possibilities. He thought of his wife, Margaret, taken by illness 3 years prior. He thought of his own wasted youth, of opportunities lost to time's relentless march. As dawn broke, Elias made his decision. He turned the dial back, further this time, 3 years, to the day before Margaret had fallen ill. The air split with a soundless cry, and once again the world wavered. When his senses returned, he was not in his workshop nor in the clock tower. He was in his own home, yet it was not as he had left it. The fire in the hearth burned warmly, and the scent of fresh bread lingered in the air. And there, standing in the doorway, was Margaret. She was exactly as he had remembered her, her auburn hair catching the morning light, her eyes full of life. "Elias?" she asked, tilting her head in confusion. You look as though you have seen a ghost." Tears welled in his eyes. He reached for her, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. She was real, warm, solid, breathing. He had done it. He had defied time itself. For a time all was well. He relished every moment, watching Margaret move through their home with the same grace he had thought lost forever. Yet beneath his joy lurked a shadow of dread. He had tampered with forces beyond his understanding. The first sign of the device's curse came that very night. As the village slept, the chimes of the clock tower rang out, once, then twice, then thrice, though the hour was wrong. The sound was discordant, unnatural, like the cry of something awakening after centuries of slumber. The wraith of Blackwood Manor. The carriage rattled along the narrow, overgrown path, its wheels crunching against the gravel as it approached the looming silhouette of Blackwood Manor. The estate had been abandoned for decades, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. To the Ashworth family, it was an unexpected inheritance, a gift from a distant relative they had never met. But as they drew closer, the air grew colder, and an unshakable sense of foreboding settled over them. Eleanor Ashworth sat beside her husband Thomas, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Their two children, Edward and Margaret, peered out the carriage window with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The manor was a stark contrast to their modest home in the city, its towering spires and jagged rooftops casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. "It is larger than I expected," Thomas remarked, his voice tinged with unease. Eleanor nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the manor. She had heard stories of Blackwood Manor as a child, whispers of tragedy and madness that had driven its inhabitants to ruin, but she had dismissed them as mere superstition. Now, as the carriage came to a halt before the imposing structure, she could not help but wonder if there was truth to the tales. The interior of the manor was as grim as its exterior. Dust-covered furniture sat in disarray, their once elegant fabrics now faded and torn. Cobwebs hung like veils from the chandeliers, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The family moved cautiously through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. "We shall have to make the best of it," Thomas said, attempting to sound optimistic. "With some work, this place could be a proper home." Eleanor forced a smile, though her heart was heavy. She could feel the weight of the manor pressing down on her, as though the very walls were alive and watching. She shook the thought from her mind, attributing it to fatigue and the unfamiliar surroundings. That night, as the family settled into their rooms, the true nature of Blackwood Manor began to reveal itself. Eleanor awoke to the sound of footsteps outside her door. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of a cane striking the floor. She glanced at Thomas, who lay sleeping beside her, and hesitated before rising to investigate. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the pale moon that filtered through the cracked windows. The footsteps had ceased, but the tapping continued, growing louder as she approached the staircase. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the source of the sound. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, its form shrouded in shadow. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by a tattered cloak. In its hand, it held a cane, which it tapped against the floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Eleanor's instincts screamed at her to flee, but she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The figure turned its head, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It spoke, its voice a hollow whisper that seemed to echo through the very walls of the manor. "You are not welcome here." Eleanor gasped, stumbling back as the figure vanished into the darkness. She returned to her room, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She told herself it had been a dream, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, she knew the truth. Blackwood Manor was haunted. The next morning, Eleanor shared her experience with Thomas, though she omitted the more terrifying details. He dismissed it as a nightmare, but the children were less skeptical. Edward, in particular, was fascinated by the idea of a ghost. "Perhaps it is the spirit of our ancestor," he suggested, his eyes wide with excitement. "The one who left us the manor." Eleanor shuddered at the thought. She had no desire to meet the former resident of Blackwood Manor, living or dead. But as the days passed, the presence in the house grew stronger. The tapping of the cane became a constant sound, echoing through the halls at all hours. Doors would slam shut on their own, and cold drafts would sweep through rooms despite the lack of windows. One night, as the family gathered in the parlor, the figure appeared again. This time, it was not alone. Shadows moved along the walls, their forms twisting and writhing like living things. The air grew icy, and the sound of whispering filled the room. "You must uncover the truth," the figure intoned, its voice a chilling blend of sorrow and menace. "The truth of my death. Only then will I find peace." Eleanor's heart pounded as she stared at the wraith. "What truth?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to you?" The figure did not answer. Instead, it raised its cane and pointed toward the library before vanishing once more. The library was a vast, dusty room filled with shelves of ancient books and yellowed parchments. The family spent days searching through the documents, piecing together the history of Blackwood Manor and its former inhabitants. They learned of the last resident, a man named Alaric Blackwood, who had died under mysterious circumstances. According to the records, he had been found dead in his study, his body showing no signs of injury or illness. But as they delved deeper, they uncovered a darker truth. Alaric had been a man consumed by jealousy and paranoia, convinced that his wife had been unfaithful. In a fit of rage, he had poisoned her, only to be consumed by guilt and grief in the days that followed. His death, it seemed, had been self-inflicted, a final act of penance for his crimes. Eleanor felt a pang of sorrow as she read the final entry in Alaric's journal. "I cannot live with what I have done. The weight of my guilt is too great to bear. I pray that one day my soul will find peace. But until then, I am bound to this place, a prisoner of my own making." That night, the wraith appeared again, its form more solid than before. It stood before the family, its eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. "You have uncovered the truth," it said, its voice softer now. "For that, I am grateful, but my time here is not yet done. There is one final task you must complete." Eleanor stepped forward, her fear replaced by a strange sense of compassion. "What must we do?" The wraith extended its hand, pointing toward the study. "Burn it," it whispered. "Burn it all." The family obeyed, gathering the journals and documents and setting them alight in the fireplace. As the flames consumed the pages, the wraith began to fade, its form dissolving into the air like smoke. The tapping of the cane ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere of the manor lifted. But as the last embers died, Eleanor noticed something strange. The portrait of Alaric Blackwood, which had hung in the study for decades, now bore a faint smile, a smile of gratitude and peace. Then came the knocking. At first it was soft, barely perceptible against the howling wind. But as the hours dragged on, it grew louder, more insistent, rattling the very walls of their home. Margaret clung to him, her breath coming in short gasps. "Elias, what is happening?" He did not answer, for he already knew. He had altered time, and time had come to collect its due. The following morning, the village was not as it had been. The streets were empty, the air thick with a silence that did not belong. Doors stood ajar, windows shattered, yet there was no sign of struggle, only an absence, as though the people had simply ceased to exist. Margaret's hand tightened around his. "Where is everyone?" Elias could not bear to tell her the truth. That night, the knocking returned. But this time, it was not at their door. It was inside the house. They fled to the clock tower, Elias clutching the device as though it were his salvation. The air was thick with whispers, voices that rose and fell in a language he did not understand. The chimes rang ceaselessly, their sound distorting into something unnatural. And then he saw them. Figures moved within the shadows, their limbs elongated, their faces obscured by the distortion of time itself. They reached for him, their fingers stretching through the void, their voices merging into one terrible command: "Set it right." With a sob of desperation, Elias turned the dial forward, reversing his meddling, undoing all he had changed. The figures vanished. The clock fell silent. When he opened his eyes, he was once again in the tower, alone. The village bustled beneath him, the world unchanged. And Margaret was gone. He had saved the world but lost her once more. With trembling hands, Elias placed the device back within its hidden compartment. He sealed it away, vowing that no living soul would ever find it again. For time was not meant to be rewritten, and the clock would always remember.